Hello and welcome to the Free Riders Podcast. My name is Brenden Dahl, and I'm joined today by two brilliant political minds.
Hi, I'm Michael.
Hi, I'm Oliver.
And we would like to clarify that though the name of the podcast is the Free Riders Podcast, all members have contributed equally and substantially to the finished product.
That is indeed true.
Very true.
Now, today's topic is going to be the Electoral College, its history and its applications in today's American government. So I'm going to give a brief introduction as the host of this episode, and then we're going to open the floor for a debate, some questions, talking about what we think the future of the Electoral College will be and how we think it's actually being used. So an introduction, many people consider the U.S. to be a fully representative democracy, but in fact, presidential elections do not actually convert the votes of citizens directly into a presidency. Instead, there is a system called the Electoral College, a group of formally appointed electors who cast the ultimate deciding vote in U.S. presidential elections. Each state appoints electors according to their own laws, often through party conventions, and the winning party gets their pre-chosen slate of electors. Each state has a number of electors equal to their representatives in Congress, so combined senators and House members. While electors historically have nearly always voted in accordance with their party in a winner-take-all model in 48 out of 50 states, there is nothing in the Constitution requiring them to do so. Maine and Nebraska, for example, allocate their electoral votes proportionally. And there are occasionally so-called faithless electors who vote against their party, the greatest number in recent history being the 10 attempted faithless electors in the 2016 election, 3 of whom were forced to reverse or be replaced by state law. Faithless electors in most states face legal and or monetary punishments for these defections. The Electoral College system was put in place by the Founding Fathers to protect the power of smaller states and ensure that candidates would not only campaign in large urban areas of higher population, as well as to provide a theoretical check on the will of the people, in the case that a significant enough portion of electors were convinced the public was voting against their own interest. Critics of the system today point to the outsized value of voters in smaller states in comparison to larger ones, and propose a simple national popular vote instead. There have been 5 elections in U.S. history where a president lost the national popular vote, but won the election, including most recently 2016, Clinton versus Trump, and 2000, Gore versus Bush. Now opening the door to questions for our other guests today. Do you guys think that the Electoral College serves the purpose today that the Founding Fathers intended?
To be honest, I'm not too familiar with the history of the specific reasons why the Electoral College was designed the way it was. I do know, the general saying that it was to protect smaller states' rights. However, I do think that there are a lot of downsides to the Electoral College in the modern world. For example, one of the main ones I think is that it discourages people from political participation, because it might cause people to think, my vote doesn't matter. And obviously in a representative democracy, we want to represent as many people as possible. So anything that discourages political participation is a downside.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. I think the reason, like you were saying, Brenden, that it's to help these smaller states to feel like they're represented in the whole nation, as well as with the House of Representatives, where it has to do with the population, how many delegates they have. But I do agree also with Michael's point that some people might feel like their vote doesn't count, or it's just not worth voting, and it leads to lower turnouts. Because also in California, for example, most of the time it is a Democratic-leaning state, and it usually turns blue during the presidential elections or other elections. So maybe it feels like for people that are also trying to vote, they feel like their vote's not going to count because it's automatically going to go blue.
Do you think that the idea that people's votes wouldn't count is something that could also be true of a national popular vote, where people would feel like if they lived in a rural area, candidates wouldn't speak to them, wouldn't campaign to them, and their needs wouldn't be as represented because candidates would be focused on the large urban areas?
Yeah, I think so, because with states being smaller and larger states, I do think that presidents or anybody like running a campaign would want to go into more of the cities and the places with larger populations. So of course there it's when the some of the public is neglected, and I think the Electoral College sort of pulls that into account, and yeah.
Yeah, I also think that having a national popular vote, even if it is an incorrect assumption, it gives people the assumption that their vote is going to count a little bit more, because I think it's not only the issue of some states that you would expect to always go red, or some states you would expect to always go blue, as Oliver mentioned. It's also that the very concept of having an electoral college is one that I think might discourage a lot of people from voting, because there's always this idea that the electors could cast their votes in a way that don't even respect the will of the majority.
Yeah, so I think summarizing some of what I've heard here and some of my own thoughts as well, I think the Electoral College for me exists due to the federalist structure of the United States, and I think that without this importance in the drafting of the Constitution given to state rights and maintaining state autonomy and power in national government, this wouldn't exist. So for me, I think the argument of protecting against the will of the people that some people attribute to the Founding Fathers has not, no election has actually been swayed by faithless electors. So in the idea that people can change if they disagree with the outcome of the election, I don't think that in practicality has ever been gone that way. But I do think that the idea that in a collection of states, preserving the power of smaller states by giving them a proportioned amount of votes that will always count, is something that, whether or not, it depends on whether or not you think federalist structure is good or not, but it is something that with this current structure, I think will continue to exist, which kind of, transcends to our next question. What do you think the biggest obstacles are to abolishing the Electoral College? And I'll preface by saying that there have been numerous efforts to do so. Probably the earliest that I know of being a movement in the 70s, post-civil rights, as kind of a last step of democratization that was actually opposed by segregationists at the time. So the first step basically, in my mind, actually has a racial element as well, and a voter suppression element. But of course, a lot of people have made very cogent points about state power and state rights in arguments since then, and you see that probably the biggest movements to abolish have followed the 2000 and 2016 elections, where Democrats especially were disillusioned with the Electoral College because they felt their candidate was robbed of a presidency because they won the popular vote but lost the election.
Sorry, 2016?
Yes, 2016, Trump lost the popular vote to Clinton, but won the national election. And then similarly in 2000, Al Gore won the popular vote, but lost to George Bush. What do you think the biggest obstacles to abolishing the Electoral College are?
I think the biggest obstacles is just getting enough people in Congress to vote on something like this. I think even though a lot of people or a lot of politicians may feel that it does affect them greatly and they do want it to be abolished, I think also because the Founding Fathers decided that this is what they wanted for our country, and we always kind of stick to the Constitution, and a lot of other politicians do as well. So I think that getting enough votes for that to happen is going to be a little difficult.
I think I agree with Oliver that this sort of opposition to something that's been such a part of American political tradition is always going to be difficult. But also, just to address sort of the way that you asked the question, the obstacles to abolishing the Electoral College, I'm not sure that it's entirely certain that the Electoral College is just, objectively a hindrance to progress or something like that. Of course, as we've already discussed, it has a lot of flaws, but I think that there's definitely a discussion on two sides. On the one hand, you have the argument of it's not the land that votes, it's the people that vote. But on the other hand, also, without the Electoral College and with just one national popular vote, there's always obviously the risk of politicians just winning the metropolises, and the people living on farms in other parts of the U.S. are just going to be left behind. So I think it's actually more about balancing the interests of all sides involved, and it comes down, I think, to a question of which one takes precedent when there's a conflict.
Yeah, and I think going back as well to that argument about the power of small states, I think a big counter argument to that is we still have the Senate, which proportions 2 senators to each state regardless of size. So yes, the House is the proportionally representative population branch of Congress, but I think the Senate will always reflect the interests of the smaller states and fight for those interests legislatively. So in terms of thinking about a president as a voice for an entire country, right? It's I think for me it becomes less a federalist issue than Congress, which is much more based on individual states and individual laws for individual states.
Indeed.
Yeah.
All right. Last question, and then we'll wrap things up today. Do you guys think the Electoral College will be abolished in our lifetime? I think I'll say I know that there have been a lot of polls that show roughly 60 to 70% of Americans do want the Electoral College abolished. I think it was 89% of Democrats compared to 23% according to a Forbes poll in 2020. But of course, like you said, there remains the massive obstacle of getting legislative support, and particularly, as I mentioned, legislative support for legislators in smaller states. So even though there can be a proportional majority in population, you still have the issue of, can you convince the senator from Wyoming to give away his state's rights? Personally, I think, I'll answer the question too, and you guys can give your thoughts. I think that it won't happen unless we abolish the filibuster and change the way that the Senate basically is structured now with such a slim majority. Historically, the last few Senate majorities have been very, very slim. So I don't think it would happen without other major changes, but I do think that those major changes are possible. So with those changes, I would say yes, I think the Electoral College could very well be abolished in our lifetimes.
Yes, I agree with Brenden. I think it is possible, but it's also a long shot. I think that in the United States, anything that goes against American political tradition and goes against quote unquote what the founding fathers intended always sort of struggles to come to be.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it is possible. I do not know again if we'll get enough votes. So like you said, the filibuster is a big issue, which leads to not being able to get enough votes for whatever you want to be passed, and that will probably lead to the Electoral College not being abolished. So I think it's important that the politicians can decide for themselves, and hope that they can decide that whatever they pick, if the Electoral College is abolished or not, that it represents the nation correctly.
All right, and that's our time for today. Thank you for listening, and good Godspeed on all future political endeavors, listener.
Thank you for having us, Brenden.
Thanks, Brenden.